Hi, I'm Sarah Glassberg,
I'm Brad Pilcher.
and this is AJFF In Conversation, the podcast where we talk about all things Jewish film. But in today's episode, we're actually going off topic just a little bit, pivoting away slightly from the silver screen and over instead to the written word.
With many folks still largely staying home, I think a lot of people are turning to not just movies and television shows to entertain themselves, but also to books. It may be the only part of the summer beach experience you can still have, sitting outside and reading.
I know that's certainly been true for me. I have so many novels to read, and while now is the perfect time to catch up, I keep acquiring more. But we are, after all, the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival.
So really what we're going to be talking about today are Jewish books that we wish were movies.
And also maybe some books about Jewish movies.
And possibly some movie-related books that happen to be written by Jews.
Clearly, there's a lot of different ways a couple of bookworm cinephiles can take this conversation. So we've come prepared based on whatever most interests each of us and whatever we each had on our bookshelves.
And with that, Sarah, what is your first pick and why?
My first pick is The Immortalists by Chloe Benjamin. This is a book that I think many people should know about. It was, I believe, a bestseller, and a ton of kind of book clubs and things like that were all over this book. I was kind of late to the party. I read this just about 6 months ago, and it blew me away. It's about four Jewish children in the Lower East Side of New York in 1969, and they get their fortunes told by this mysterious traveling psychic. But more specifically, they're each told the date when they'll die. So kind of a dark premise, but they each have sections of the book devoted to their stories. And so they take place in all of these different decades and areas of the country. You have Simon, who's the youngest. He moves to San Francisco. His story takes place from the late 70s to the early 80s amidst the start of the AIDS crisis. You have Clara, the next oldest, who moves to Las Vegas to become a magician. And her story goes from 82 to 91. And then there's Daniel, the next oldest. His story spans from 91 to 2006, but really focuses a lot on his time as an army doctor post 9/11. And lastly, you have Variah, the oldest child, who ends up being a scientific researcher on reversing aging, essentially. So each of their stories, they're really grappling with how to live their lives with this knowledge. Do they, and also combined with their Jewish upbringing, that actually comes up a lot in the film, just their Jewish parents, and they have this kind of stereotypical Jewish mother. But I just love the way Jewish sort of spiritualism and mysticism all kind of intersect and intertwine in this story. And it's just got so many rich themes, and this is just one of my favorite books of all time.
They're siblings, right?
Yeah. So it's four siblings. Mm-hmm.
I know the book is broken up into sections for each of the four, but are there stories, like they're siblings, so I'd imagine they're interacting with each other in each section, right?
Some of them, yeah. So Clara moves to San Francisco with Simon. They're the first two to kind of leave the nest after the patriarch of the family passes away. And it's at that point, after the funeral, that each of them are kind of sharing what the fortune told had said to them years ago. And so some of them do intersect. You have some family, let's just say, tensions, though, at the same time. So there are a lot of time periods where the siblings are estranged, and so the chapters kind of, it varies based on these very complicated relationships and over the span of many, many years.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to imagine this adapted into a film or a television show. And again, I haven't read the book, so I don't know the story, but I'm trying to like picture how they would do the stories if they would just do them as chapters. But if they're really interacting with each other, then you almost can maybe bounce back and forth, so it could work as like a television show where you're really following all four characters at the same time. But if it was a movie, you could do it as distinct chapter. You could really keep to that structure that the book has.
Yeah, see, well, I actually was thinking kind of the opposite way about it. Like I heard that this has been picked up for television. I'm not sure if it's planned to be a limited series or a full TV series, and I'm kind of conflicted about that because I think if it were on TV, it would really allow each character's stories to kind of stand alone like they do in the book and have a lot of time to breathe, to kind of breathe and be told fully versus, the trouble with film adaptations of books is you lose some nuance, you lose some details, you lose some plot, honestly, because there's just so much that you can't fit in. But at the same time, I almost like the idea that if it were a film, instead of it being these, because some of the timelines do overlap a little bit, even if the siblings aren't necessarily in the same space, I kind of like the idea of jumping around in time. And you also don't really, when you're focused on Simon, for instance, you only get a little bit of what's happening with some of the other siblings because you're so focused on Simon. So I don't know. I almost feel like a film could look at what each of the characters are kind of going through concurrently, even though that's actually not covered in the book as much. You're really, for instance, like with Daniel and with Faria, you're only getting what Simon experiences of their, when they are calling him in San Francisco to try to get him to come home, he's breaking their mother's heart, all of that kind of stuff. You only see that from Simon's perspective. And I think a film could play around with time and not be so locked into the structure that the book has. But at the same time, I don't know, it could work well as a TV show. I'm always conflicted. I mean, I don't know when any of us are returning to movie theaters, but this is just this sweeping story that I would love to see on an actually, big screen. It's the other part of this for me.
Well, as someone who has not read the book, I will ask without trying to dip into spoilers, well, I have a few questions. One is, does the structure of the book, do you just stay with Simon and then you finish up Simon's story and then you jump to the next sibling, or does it actually jump back and forth between each of the four characters, quote unquote, chapters or storylines?
It's broken up pretty distinctly. And part of that is because, without getting too much into spoiler territory, each of these characters is given their death date. And so the reason it's broken up into these distinct eras is because that character may or may not live past
their deaths.
The year that their segment says it's going to end. At the beginning of each chapter, it has those dates that I was kind of rattling off. But and there's a reason for that. But at the same time, you do get just that little bit of overlap. Like I said, with Clara, I think her story ends in 91, and you do get Daniel's story starting in 91. But as far as the flow of the book, it's broken up where you finish out Simon's story and you move on to Clara's. But I think a film, I think there's some creative liberties that could be taken to play with that a little bit.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me whenever I look at a film being adapted from a book is, what are the aspects of the book that you want to make sure you translate, and what are the aspects of the book that either are not as important to the core story, or they just, they don't work, they don't matter as much, so you can kind of put them off by the wayside. And one of the things that you mentioned was this idea of, there are certain things that you get mostly from Simon's story, even though they sort of involve or impact all the siblings. You're really, for that aspect of the story, you're focusing on that through the view of Simon. And again, without having read the book, the question for me is, how important are those elements, and how important is it that those elements are seen through that particular character's perspective? Because when you're going to change the structure or the storyline from the book, if you're doing, whether it's a TV show or a movie, I could imagine a filmmaker really wrestling with the idea of, is it important that we see this specifically from Simon's perspective, or is it more interesting to take this part of the story and show you all of the siblings' intersections with that? And what exactly is the message of the book, and what is the message of the story that you're trying to carry across the film? And there's no right answer to that, but it's an interesting thing to grapple with when you get a book that's this particularly structured and you're trying to translate that on screen.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said, I'm conflicted. Like, as you're asking me these questions, I don't know the answers. I don't know where I firmly come down on some of these, because the thing about Simon's story is that he is grappling with his sexuality and coming out as a young gay man. And so I do think that his experiences in San Francisco and dealing with having left his family and having, again, without too many spoilers, but having the sort of youngest death date prescribed to him, I do think that that's needs to be told through his particular kind of lens. But at the same time, what's interesting to me about this book is that each of the segments kind of build off of each other, in that not only each character is grappling with the death date that this fortune teller had given them as children, but they're also then grappling with the deaths of their family members. Like, again, the patriarch dies, but then beyond that, they are dealing with the death of Simon, and then things progress from there. And so when you get to Daniel and when you get to Variah, especially, I could almost see Variah's experience being this kind of frame narrative. Like if it were a film, I could, because all of her research and all of her neuroses, she is this very like diagnosed obsessive compulsive disorder character. And I could see her outliving all her siblings as being the kind of frame narrative that shapes the rest of the film, because again, it's like this snowball effect. And I think that's what's so powerful about the book.
It's almost worse to be the oldest one, because if you're the youngest, it's like, well, you got a death date. Who cares? It's a fortune teller. I'm not going to believe that. But then as you watch your siblings off, and I don't know if that's exactly what happens, but I can imagine the struggle. It's got a female author, so I'm curious if you would think it needs a female director.
Well, thank you for asking that, because you know me too well. Yeah, I even though two of the siblings are men, I do feel like I want a female director for this. It just has, I would love to see Greta Gerwig tell this story specifically. I know I've talked about her on the podcast before, but I'm just thinking about the way that she adapted the script of Little Women, which is another obviously classic novel, but she adapted that in such a unique way, and she gave it such a kind of modern voice, and she did these really seamless kind of time jumps in that film. And I think that she could do something like what we're talking about with this book. Like, I think she can really creatively look at the time spans of these characters and weave them together into something really compelling that really moves forward the story in a way that works for film, versus maybe the way that it is written in the book wouldn't work for film. I think, again, I mentioned that this book has a lot of really rich themes. I mean, we've been kind of dancing around some of them, but death and family and identity and grief and heartache and love. And I just think that she would find such a great balance between all of those things, the darker themes, the more hopeful, joyful moments. I could see her adapting this book, even though I think the author of the book is Jewish and Greta Gerwig is not. The first female director that popped into my mind for this was her.
What about casting? Do you have any casting? You're gonna make this movie in about 10 years, Sarah. You know,
I will see. I don't know about that, but I have some ideas for casting. You know, it's weird. I'm such a bookworm, and there are some books that lend themselves really easily to me casting them in my head. This one wasn't so much like that, so it was kind of a fun exercise thinking about this for today. I could see Rachel Weisz playing Variah, the eldest sibling. I could maybe see Adrian Brody as Daniel, and maybe Logan Lerman as Simon. And I was trying to think of actors who are at least part Jewish for this, obviously. And Clara is the one I just can't seem to really pinpoint who I'd want for that. But yeah, I mean, the gears, like I said, the gears have been turning now. Not necessarily for me to make the film, but it's a fun exercise, right? To cast one of your favorite books in your head. So
Yeah, I actually, again, have not read the book, so I don't know anything.
I'll have to let you borrow my copy. It's so astounding. Yeah.
I want to. You have sold me on it. I've never heard of this book, so I'm very very eager to read it. I just reading the synopsis, reading about the discussion around this book. For some reason, what jumped out to me was the film Never Let Me Go, which is a decade ago, but Mark Romanek directed it. It was sort of a sci-fi film, but very lightly so, with Keira Knightley and Carey Mulligan. It had this feel of people facing their fates, and not to get too spoilery around that film, but that was a film sort of set in an alternate society where they had sort of perfected the art of basically raising children essentially as clones, but they were kind of not really clones. They were just sort of there for body parts. They were there, and they had a point where they would be harvested. Essentially, I'm grossly oversimplifying the film, but it had this. There were these three friends, and you follow them from their early school days into young adulthood, and the kind of it's a very very sad story because they all kind of know their fate. And for some reason, I thought immediately of that film when I was reading the synopsis. So I'm all on board with a female director and Greta Gerwig, but I would be fascinated to see a take by Mark Romanek. And actually, the screenplay for that film was written by Alex Garland, who I will talk about for one of my book picks that I would love to see adaptation work on. But I don't know if you ever saw Never Let Me Go, but that was the only thought that I had in terms of casting and directing.
Yeah, that's one of those movies that for years now has just escaped me. Like it's been on my list of films I want to watch, and then I just never watch it, which is like it's just there's no excuse for it, but I've always wanted to see it. It looks fascinating, and I love that cast. Andrew Garfield, is he the other?
Yes,
You've
yes.
talked about it, yeah, him before. So that could be another good casting idea, actually, for if not Immortalists, for one of my other picks that we'll talk about. So yeah, I'll have to seek out that film for a few different reasons. But Brad, I want to hear about your first pick. I've gone on too long about the Immortalists.
Well, my first pick is a little bit of a cheat. It is a book that has already been made into a film, but not a good one, and it should be remade forthwith. But the book is The Phantom Toll Booth by Norton Juster, and of course illustrated by Jules Feiffer. This is a book that does not necessarily jump out as a Jewish book. It's a book by Jewish author and illustrator, and certainly influenced by Jewish cultural memes, but a classic of children's fantasy. And I think everybody that I knew grew up with it. It was a staple when I was a kid. It is a delightful novel that sort of follows a young boy named Milo who unexpectedly gets a magic toll booth. And by going in through that toll booth in his toy car, which is just sort of a cute visual, he goes to the Kingdom of Wisdom, a very troubled place where he acquires a couple of companions, and then goes on this quest to restore the kingdom and its exiled princesses. It is, in that way, kind of a traditional fantasy quest where you go to a different world, Alice in Wonderland. This is not a trope that is that people don't know of already. But what was delightful about this particular book is that it is all about learning. There's all these sort of wonderful puns. There's an island of conclusions that you have to jump to get to. So you literally have to jump to conclusions. It's just those kind of word plays and idioms and puns that were wonderful for a kid's imagination, and so much a part of the book. And so those gags were really influenced by the Marx Brothers. They were really influenced by the sort of Jewish background of Norton Juster, who was kind of an interesting story in and of himself. I mean, he's an architect and had gotten a grant to write a totally different book, but just couldn't quite bring himself to do it and wrote this instead. And it's gone on to be one of the most beloved children's books of the 20th century, published back in 1961. So I think they just did like a 50-year anniversary release a few years back. It is just wonderful. and it was made by Chuck Jones in 1969 in a not very good adaptation that Norton Juster actually called Drivel. So not something I would recommend anybody go hunt down and seize. So it has been made, but I think it should be remade because today I think we have the tools and the technology to make a spectacle of a story like this, and to use animation in a clever way. And that's what I want to see, which you did not see in 1969.
Yeah, I mean, I read this book when I was a kid. I didn't know any of the Jewish context or influences. What I'm curious about is I do remember sort of the jumping to conclusions and a lot of the wordplay. And I don't know. On one hand, it's interesting to me that it hasn't been readapted because it just seems like such a classic and so ripe for kind of visual representation of these things. But at the same time, do you think what maybe didn't work so well the first time, or what might be tricky to translate even now, is kind of the kind of wordplay stuff that doesn't maybe lend itself as well to the visual medium? Or do you think, like, how do you see that creative kind of translation going in your ideal adaptation?
I think that's going to be the hardest part. And I think that there's lots of ways around it. I think there's clever use of animation, clever use of computer generated imagery, can certainly help with that. But I always found the characters in this story the most compelling parts, because those were as interesting as kind of the wordplay was. The characters really jumped off the page in my mind. And, you've got this giant dog with a clock on the side of him, and that I think is where you can really go crazy. And then I would imagine that the way in which the performances could, and the dialogue and the scripting could really dwell on those world play could be a really delightful thing. I mean, it's interesting. Juster, as a child, had synesthesia. He could only do math by making associations between numbers and colors, because he just couldn't do it any other way. That's how his mind worked in terms of understanding math and numbers. And so he brought that juxtaposition and interchange of colors and shapes and visuals and words and language to the book. And so you have, numbers that are gems. You just have these wonderful kind of visuals that are there, that are easily adapted to film. And so the wordplay, I think, is really in the dialogue. I mean, when you look at what, I'm not a Johnny Depp fan. I am not even necessarily a fan of the Alice in Wonderland films of recent vintage. But when you imagine that kind of delightful performance that Johnny Depp gave in those films, where he really was sort of just chewing the script, he was chewing the concepts, and it was through his face and his performance that you really got a lot of that. That's kind of what I would imagine. I would want to see. I mean, there's a lot of directors that could easily jump into this. I'm actually torn between Spike Jonze, Michel Gondry, or Guillermo del Toro. Jones kind of had his shot with adapting a famous children's book by a Jewish author when he did Where the Wild Things Are. I feel like, though, the challenge that he had with that one was that there's not enough in Where the Wild Things Are to make a feature-length film, so he had to fill in a bunch of stuff. That's not the case here, so maybe he would do better, because I think that was a somewhat failed film. But Michel Gondry is equally as interesting. I think he would be fun to explore it. Certainly Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and what he did in terms of taking a construct of mental abstraction and then visualizing it in the ways that he did very, very creatively, I think would work very well here. But also there's a part of me that's deeply curious to take a very different kind of sensibility that you get with someone like Guillermo del Toro, very dark, very scary sensibility, but have him use his imagination to imagine all of these creatures and all of these characters and all of these sort of visual puns that are in existence in that world. Any one of those three directors, I think, could have a field day with this. I'm not sure who is the right one, but that's kind of how I think it would be approached.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my next question, actually. Like, who would you want to direct this? I'm partial to, I love Guillermo del Toro, but I'm partial to Michel Gondry, just based on what you were saying about the idea of synesthesia, which is a whole area of film studies, by the way. So it's really fascinating. I think Michel Gondry has demonstrated this ability to kind of take other textures and materials and types of animation. I'm thinking beyond Eternal Sunshine, you have things like Science of Sleep, which he does a lot of like weird puppetry and a lot of use of like paper mache almost. And then he did similar things in Mood Indigo, which I think was also a literary adaptation. So I could almost see Michel Gondry kind of bringing that sensibility to the story, which could be really cool. But the other thing I'm thinking of, and I don't necessarily champion this over any of those three directors, but you mentioned Johnny Depp, and I'm thinking about so much of his chewing up the scenery and the script and everything is Tim Burton, right? Like I could almost picture this going a very Tim Burton way as well.
It could, although, for me, Tim Burton's mileage varies, and the longer we've seen Tim Burton making movies, the less mileage I get out of him. So that would be my big fear of handing this to someone like him is versus someone like Guillermo del Toro, who also has a very strong aesthetic. But Guillermo del Toro's aesthetic is not fixed, and it feels very fixed with Tim Burton. It's like he's got his look. He makes this stuff. You see it. Is there something that's curling up into a spiral somewhere that has no reason to be doing that?
He's a one-trick pony for sure.
Yeah, and this is what's interesting about the Phantom Tollbooth is that it is a book that is about learning, but in a very imaginative, childlike way that is not shackled to the sort of strictures of traditional school environments. So, I mean, it's playing with you, and therefore it has an inventiveness and a fluidity to it that I would want to see come through in the film adaptation. And if it just becomes kind of a canvas for a very particular aesthetic, it's not necessarily going to not work, but it will definitely be less than it could be as a film adaptation. And for me, that's the sort of the spirit of it that you want to carry over into the film. It's this notion of the delight you can have in just sort of taking these concepts like numbers or time and turning them into physical aspects in a world instead of just sort of thinking of them as literally what they are. And that requires a sense of imaginative boundary pushing. I agree with you. I think Michel Gondry probably is the best pick to do this. Certainly, he's done it before. He's got examples in his filmography that you've mentioned. It's surprising to me that this hasn't been adapted again. I mean, I don't know if it's just because the rights are tied up. I really don't know what the backstory is in terms of what is keeping this off the screen, but it's just begging for an adaptation. I don't know. Is there another book that you have that you would recommend that you would love to see adapted?
Yeah. So this one, I actually do know the backstory of why it hasn't been adapted yet, more or less. My second pick is The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, another book that was a huge bestseller. So I won't spend too much time on the plot, but it's essentially this tale of two Jewish cousins, a Czech artist named Joe Cavalier and Brooklyn-born writer Sammy Clay. They go on to become these major icons in the burgeoning comic book industry. Joe is a fan of Houdini and he's a talented artist. He leaves his entire family behind and escapes from Nazi-occupied Prague in a coffin, which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of sort of golem folklore weaved into that, which I love. And he goes to live with Sammy, and they ultimately create the Escapist, who's this anti-fascist superhero. And a lot of the events in the novel are based on the actual lives of comic book creators, including Jack Kirby, Bob Kane, Stan Lee, Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, Joe Simon. But similar to The Immortalists, the thing I love about this book, I keep wanting to say movie, wishful thinking that it is a movie already, I guess. But this book is this sweeping story. It has themes of family and identity like The Immortalists. It again does that thing of kind of weaving in some folklore, some mysticism and magic into something that's otherwise this family story, and kind of taking you through many, many years of history. And as far as why it hasn't been adapted yet, I think even more than The Immortalists and straight from the author's mouth, it's just very hard to adapt this. I think it from 2002 to 2004-ish, I was reading that it was going to be a film version, that Stephen Daldry wanted to direct it. There was an update on Michael Chabon's website in about 2005 about some casting rumors. I actually have a quote from his sort of blog post about that. He said, Tobey Maguire would be Sam Clay, Jamie Bell would be Joe Cavalier, and Natalie Portman would be Rosa Sachs. He said, it buzzed very seriously for about 11 minutes. Then it went away. My reaction, since you asked, Natalie Portman, perfect. Tobey Maguire, interesting choice. Like to see it. Jamie Bell, isn't he like 15? So this was just something kind of amusing to me looking back, because again, this was casting rumors from 15 years ago. I think those casting choices could have been really great, but there was just this kind of whack-a-mole between Scott Rudin, who would have produced the film, and Michael Chabon trying to write the script. And what do you, again, choose to leave out versus what do you choose to include? And just for reference with the ages, Joe and Sammy at the beginning of the novel are supposed to be aged 19 and 17. So now these actors have kind of aged out the other way, but I don't know. There's always movie magic, right? So I'm not, kind of jumping ahead to the casting question. I'm not sure who I would like to see in this, but what I am excited about is that, similar to The Immortalists again, this has apparently been picked up for like a Showtime limited series run. So I think it'll give enough time for the story to really breathe. There are all these periods of time where the book kind of skips and you don't really see those characters for a while. So it's a beautiful book. It's a classic. It's a modern kind of American literary classic, but I could definitely, reading up on all this, see why it's been so difficult to adapt, which is unfortunate, but I have hope for the future of it on screen, even if it's on TV.
It's interesting, actually, that 15 years ago, this was not the case for Michael Chabon, but he has since found his way into film production, television specifically. He basically show ran the first season of Star Trek Picard on CBS All Access recently. He's not show running the second season, but he is still involved in some form or fashion. He's been involved in helping to write some of the short treks on Star Trek, and I think he actually has with his wife now has a deal with CBS. So it would be interesting to see him take this book and try to adapt it with a more active role in things like casting, things like the writing and the scripting. I actually feel like when I compare this to Wonder Boys worked wonderfully, pardon the pun, as a film, as a sort of contained story. This book, to me, feels like a TV series because there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of development to the characters that you would just inherently lose in a 2-hour movie. And it needs that room to breathe. What I do think would work perfectly as a film franchise is the actual character, the escapist that they create, that Michael Chabon then went out and wrote books that were just the story of the escapists, sort of parallels to this book. So if you wanted to make that into a movie, it would be very easy to do. You've got the combination of superhero, but also you could do a period piece and set it back in that time frame and have a very, very interesting little franchise there. So it is. I am curious if Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay ever does make it to the screen, whether it's the big screen or the small screen, how involved Michael Chabon will be in it, as opposed to what it felt like 15 years ago was like, I've sold the rights. I don't know. They're not asking me. But now maybe he would be sort of right there, intimately involved in the production.
Yeah, I hope so. I think that that's kind of the only way to do this right. But I do like the idea of adapting The Escapist, either in addition or instead of. I know that was already adapted into comic book form. One of my favorite comic book writers, Brian K. Vaughan, was doing that, I think. So that could be really cool. I never thought about that. What I was thinking about is if this were a movie, if it were confined to a 2.5 hour, 3 hour runtime, who I would like to see direct. And I was really hung up on the idea that Stephen Daldry wanted to do it, only because his style is so kind of melodramatic. He leans into that, the sentimentality, and this book has that. But I also think there's a little bit of magical realism going on, some of that comic book excitement that can easily be really fleshed out, and you also have some romance and attention to period detail. And so my pick for that would be David Fincher, just because people I think don't love The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. It's actually one of my favorites, and I think he can really balance out this sentimental kind of sepia toned epic that sweeps across many years, but he would also get the suspenseful aspects and the dramatic aspects really well. All of that being said, I do think this is one where if it does come to fruition on TV, that would probably be a good thing for this book. And like you said, I hope Michael Chabon. I didn't know that he was involved in the Star Trek, the recent Star Trek installment. So I think he would. I think he would do well to be more involved. So fingers crossed going forward with this.
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about him as a creative. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and I'm not entirely sure that he got all of Star Trek right when he was involved in it. Still is, but he's also an incredible writer. I've read many of his stuff, and he's a great storyteller. So I would like to see, this is the kind of thing where I would love to see him be involved rather than the typical way where you write a book, you option it, and then you just sort of sit back and hope that whatever the other people do with it works, but you don't really have a say in it. And this doesn't feel like the kind of story that will benefit from that, particularly because it is such a Jewish story. I mean, it is Michael Chabon. Everything he writes, he steeps in Judaism, if he can get away with it overtly. If he can't get away with it overtly, he works it in sort of covertly. And this is, if you option this to somebody and they produce it and they don't bring Jewishness, then you're just missing out an enormous aspect of the story, and his involvement would kind of help guarantee that doesn't happen. And I'm not sure who. I mean, I would love to see Natalie Portman involved as a producer or even as a director, maybe, because I think she has a sensibility in the work that she chooses, and certainly in her directorial debut that lines up a little bit with this book. But David Fincher, I think you're spot on. I think he would capture that. It is a balancing act because it is kind of a pulpy story, but it's also a very, very deeply dramatic, melodramatic at times story. Either way, it's definitely one that is part of the literary canon of late 20th century, early 21st century American literature, and absolutely is overdue for a film adaptation. So I'm with you there.
Yeah, I'm glad you agree. I want to hear what your next pick is, though.
All right. Well, my next pick is also, again, a little bit of a cheat because it's not a book. It's 20 books. Specifically, there is a series of novels by Daniel Silva, who is a sort of spy thriller writer, and they center on a character named Gabriel Alan, who was an Israeli Mossad operative, and also an art restorer, apparently, because, why not? The novels started back in 2000 with The Kill Artist, and he sort of put them out very regularly ever since. And so we're up to 20 of these books at this point. The backstory on Alan as a character is he was part of the team that went after the terrorists from the Munich Olympics. So he is recruited into Mossad and sent out to track down the Black September terrorists and essentially assassinate them, bring them to justice. And he goes on to become one of the most talented Mossad operatives that there are, but also, one who is deeply impacted by this work and the violence of this work. And, just sort of longs to live a quiet life, restoring, paintings and sort of, being calm and peaceful. but he just can't. He can't. He keeps getting pulled back in, and it's interesting because it's an Israeli character. There's a lot of Jewish metaphysical and philosophical musings in these books, but at their heart, they're thriller, spy, pulp novels, and they are globe-trotting. They are not James Bond. They're not satirical. They're not over the top. There's not a bunch of gadgets. There are no cars where the headlights pop out and machine guns jump out. These are much more grounded stories. But Gabriel Allon, even though he's Israeli, is often not living in Israel. He's in London, or he's in the south of Italy, and he keeps getting pulled back in. And so there is this quality where Daniel Silva, I think, was using this as an excuse to travel around the world and write it all off for tax purposes as research. But it has engendered a huge fan base, huge audience, and for some reason, to date, has never been made into a film or television show, which I don't understand. It has been optioned. MGM TV acquired the rights about 3 years ago, actually, to the whole series of novels. And I assume that MGM TV was planning on making it into a television series, which would have made sense. That being said, MGM has never been the most financially sound enterprise in recent years, and so as far as I know, that project is dead. But they may still have the rights. I do not know, and that may be the thing that holds it up. But it's just when in a world of Bourne Identity films and Bond spy films that, even though they're very Bondian, have sort of, with the Daniel Craig era, veered into a more grounded reality. This is a ripe franchise with tons of story potential. You can mine literally 20 novels. You could make 20 movies adapting one novel each, and you still wouldn't run out of material. And by then, I'm sure Daniel Silva probably would have written 20 more. So I lament every day that there is not a Gabriel Allon franchise on screen. It makes me very sad. And, as a fan of this genre, it makes me doubly sad.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me, I've never read these, but it sounds to me like in a perfect world, you'd have this really epic, but still very grounded in realism kind of spy franchise of many, many films. So my question for you would be, who would you want to direct at least some of those films if they were to ever be a thing?
Well, I think that I envision this as a film franchise. Certainly, it could be a television series, but my gripe with spy television is that it's been done a lot recently. There's a Jack Ryan TV series. It just, it's like everything starts to become part of the mythology. When you do that genre on television, you just sort of have to have these long arcs and all of these loose threads. And I don't think you need that. I'm a fan of a good old spy adventure that ends with the bad guy going down and the good guy. And certainly you can have some moral ambiguity in there. You can have a few loose ends, but I want to see it on screen. And so I would love to see at least the first couple of films handled by Alex Garland, who I mentioned earlier, who is an English writer and filmmaker who he has an interesting career because he wrote the novel The Beach, was sort of praised as a Gen X, one of the great voices of Generation X. Then did the screenplay for 28 Days Later and Sunshine, films that I happen to love, but nothing at all like The Beach. And then he did Never Let Me Go. He wrote the screenplay for that film, which I mentioned earlier. But he's also done video games. He did Dread. He did the adaptation for Dread. And then finally, after writing a bunch of screenplays that were kind of all over the place, working in video games, he finally started directing with Ex Machina back in 2014, which is just mwah. I can't.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite films of all time, if I could just say that. Oh my goodness.
It is amazing. And then he followed it up with Annihilation with Natalie Portman in 2018, which was an adaptation of a novel he did not write. So his career has been varied in a good way. He's currently working on the miniseries Devs, which is on Hulu. he goes into science fiction, he goes into action, he goes into dramatic places. Nothing that he's done though has been campy or corny. It's all been very grounded, even except for maybe Dread. Every which he just wrote, he didn't direct, but he has an ability to take stories that are interesting, adventurous, that have that element, but then ground them, which is exactly what the Gabriel Allon films need. Because again, it's a spy adventure. You're going all over the globe. You're chasing down terrorists. There's bombings. There's gunfights. But it's not that kind of high camp factor that you get with classic James Bond. It's not super action oriented the way that you got with the Bourne films. It's much more like, these are real people in a real world struggling with their real lives. And I think that he's also phenomenal with character work. His ability to both cast well, but then also because he's a screenwriter originally, and a writer originally, a novelist originally, he has the ability to sort of fill out these characters. And the Gabriel Allon world has a lot of characters that recur. There's Gabriel Allon, obviously, but there's also the team around him. So you have Ari Shamron, who is sort of the former head of Mossad, who originally recruited him into Mossad and is kind of there as the spy boss who's back at home, the sort of gruff father figure, if you will. There's Gabriel's wife. There's various agents that work around him, Uzi Navad and Eli Levan, who are all kind of former Mossad operatives and also have side careers. And so each one of these characters has a lot of potential if they are written well, if they are cast well, to be really interesting side characters to create this great ensemble. And you need a director who can do that really well, who can cast and write really well. And to me, Alex Garland is the perfect director to do it. But he's not necessarily like the biggest name director that you'll ever find, but he is absolutely the perfect one.
And who do you think should be cast in these? Because you mentioned that he's really good with knowing who to cast, but
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm terrible at casting, so I always am reluctant to do this. I mean, I think that the character of it would be very tempting, I think, in a lot of studios, if they got their hands on this, would want to go young. They would want to cast a young guy. They would want to go the direction that you went with Jack Ryan on television, which to me doesn't resonate. One of the things that I've always said about, if you go back and watch classic stuff like Hunt for Red October, you go back to their 80s and 70s, the actors they just weren't, even if they were that young at the time, they didn't seem young. They didn't look young. And I think you have to understand that, you got a character here that by the time we are with Gabriel Allon, he is not young. He is not wet behind the ears. He is definitely someone who's seen a lot, and then continues to keep seeing a lot. And there's a lot of tragedy that's visited upon him. But, this is a guy that got his start in the 70s. So you don't want to go too young. I think the youngest you could possibly go would be Oscar Isaac, who is a phenomenal actor and could chew the scenery, but you could see him maybe putting on a little bit of weight, playing the role a little bit more world weary. But the actor that would have been perfect, if you could find a way, if you were willing to triple the budget and use de-aging technology, is if you could get Jean Reno circa like 1996, right around the time he did Mission Impossible, mid-90s Jean Reno, absolutely the perfect, because he looks middle-aged. He feels world weary, but he's still young enough and he's still active enough where you're like, yeah, I could see him. He's out in the field. He's doing this stuff. But I don't know. That's the trick, though, is that you want this to feel like these are characters who, again, you could follow through 20 years of story, but when you start with them, they're not young. So it's not like you want the Chris Pine kind of casting situation where you get somebody who just looks like a kid. You're like, no, you're not old enough. You don't have the look. You want someone who has that kind of, they've got a little bit of weight, they've got a little bit of, life they've lived a certain amount of their life and they're already carrying some scars with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I will say about Oscar Isaac, if it were Alex Garland, they've worked together twice now in Ex Machina and Annihilation. So I feel like, again, having not read these books, but as far as like a director-actor relationship, something really cool could come from that collaboration again, I think.
I agree. And I think Alex Garland should be getting a lot more credit than he gets. I think among
Hmm.
cinephiles, he gets a lot of credit because there's a lot of fans of Annihilation and Ex Machina, and certainly the films that he has been in, there. He has yet to be involved with a film that's really bad. Even the films where he was just, he was just the writer or whatever, and even on Dread, which is not like nobody thinks that Dread is a cinematic classic per se, but Carl Urban, I think, said that he felt like Alex Garland kind of shadow directed that film. It's not a huge filmography, but when you go through the list of the ones that he's at least been a writer or a director on, they're all really good. 28 Days Later, Sunshine, Never Let Me Go, Dread, Ex Machina, Annihilation, and then now with Devs, which is a great television show. The idea of giving him a franchise for at least two or three films that let him sort of put his stamp on it and set the tone for that franchise and increase his profile, that to me would be as good as having some Gabriel Allon films to sink your teeth into. For me, Alex Garland is amazing, and I will if you say he's making something, I'm like, all right, I'm there. I'm ready to watch it. So that's kind of how I feel about Alex Garland.
And one last thing I'll say about that is just that as a fan of the Southern Reach trilogy, which is the trilogy of books that Annihilation is the first one of, and he did that adaptation. Speaking from that perspective, he did such a good job adapting that and knowing what to change, how to keep it the same in spirit and essence without feeling completely beholden to the source material in a way that made it more limiting. He really got that adaptation and did so well with it. So he'd probably be a good pick.
Yeah. Well, that's the key, because that and Annihilation the book and Annihilation the film, if you put them right next to each other, there's a lot of difference. But that sort of essence is there in both, and that's the hardest part of adapting a novel to film is you will lose a huge amount of plot points. You just will. There's no way that you can take a novel and condense it.
But how do you keep the tone and how do you keep the vibe is really becomes the question.
Yeah, it's gotta feel that spirit, that spiritual essence, and he absolutely has shown that he can do it. So let's flip the script a little bit, Sarah. Rather than talk about books that are fictional and that we would love to see adapted to film, both of us are armchair film scholars, and we have small libraries full of books about Jewish film and the world of Jewish storytelling. I'm curious if you have a particular favorite that you like to recommend.
I do. Yeah. It's not exclusively about film. It's called Jewish Comedy, A Serious History by Jeremy Dauber, who is a professor of Yiddish language, literature, and culture at Columbia University. And this book really looks at almost every medium that you can think of where Jewish comedy has been a thing. And that ranges from poetry and scripture to film and television and stand up comedy and literature. It just covers everything. And what it does is he tries to sort out the question of what is Jewish comedy, what is Jewish about comedy, and kind of places it into these seven strands. I think it's seven strands, but it's these different strands, such as kind of vulgarity, wit, satire, and as far as how that intersects with film, he uses basically films and filmmakers as examples to talk about these various strands. So it's just very interesting if you want to learn more about Ernst Lubitsch, who we discussed in our first episode of this podcast, and to be or not to be, but placing that within a very American Jewish satire context and looking at what that is and where that comes from. He also looks at Mel Brooks in terms of both vulgarity and parody and really analyzes and dissects how those go hand in hand for him and in general. And it's hard for a book to be both academic and interesting and also funny. And it is a book about comedy, so you'd hope that it's funny. And he really makes it accessible, and it's a really fun nonfiction read if you're interested in Jewish comedy, which I very much am. So I'd recommend it.
Yeah, I was going to say that Jeremy Dauber is one of those academics, and I've never met him, but having read the book, it's he's one of those rare academics who's funny and approachable and can speak in a kind of way that makes you want to keep reading and turning the page and makes the whole material accessible without losing the rigor of academia, which is a rare thing. I mean, I've read many books by professors that are just they're academic in that and in the worst possible way, and that is absolutely not this book at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a former film studies student and, going to school twice for that, I didn't get that much of a chance ever to really I got some opportunities to learn about television studies, but not as much as I would have liked. And so I personally just really liked the way this book again kind of looks at a full spectrum of where Jewish comedy pops up, how those things relate to each other over time. Some of my favorite TV shows are mentioned in here within these different strands, including Seinfeld and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And again, I like the opportunity to look at film from not just a film studies perspective, but under this other umbrella, and also connecting it to other media that I'm really passionate about, but just never really got as much of an opportunity to learn about. So that's why I'm recommending this book too, is, we talk even this episode, right? Like we're talking about movies, but there's so many other aspects of pop culture and Jewish culture that are interesting. And I just love the way Jeremy Dauber finds the through lines there and analyzes all these things within these really clear and concise kind of categories that you might not even realize exist. I think going into kind of reading through this book, I could have maybe talked a little bit about what Jewish comedy is or what that means, but he really breaks it down into very fascinating little pieces. So it's an interesting exercise in looking at something that you think you know and understand, but there's always a deeper analysis to be had there and a greater history to look at.
Yeah, Jewish comedy has always been a little bit like pornography. That famous Supreme Court justice who said that pornography, he doesn't know what pornography is, but he knows it when he sees it. Jewish comedy has that same kind of feel. You just kind of know it when you see it, when you hear it. But for someone to try and explain it is a challenge. And that is what I liked about his approach, was that he's not just sort of trying to show you a chronological evolution. There is some evolution to it, but he's really showing you the interplays and the way that these different strands influenced each other and then seeped out into the popular culture and then got repackaged. And so you do get a sense of the way it all kind of weaves together. And so when you see someone like Ernst Lubitsch, and then you go decades later and you see someone like Mel Brooks, and you see the ways that they're connected, but also distinct in the way that one represents an evolution of the other. So and across mediums, across times, across different aspects, that it's like looking at a prism. You get that beautiful kind of a deep understanding of Jewish comedy from all the different angles.
Exactly. I think you said it perfectly. What is your pick for kind of a more nonfiction Jewish film book?
Well, my pick is very particular to me because I started my career as a designer, and I have a huge collection of coffee table books. And when you put those two facts together, it was very easy for me to pull Saul Bass, A Life in Film and Design, off of my shelf and plop it down on the table, because it is a huge book. It is physically a huge square, and it is very thick. It literally encompasses the entire life and career of Saul Bass, who, if you did not know, is the man who brought us the merger of the visuals in films, particularly film credit sequences, and the marketing campaign of film posters, and the imagery of those two things being together conjoined was something that was not common when he started working in the 1950s. Before that, film credits were very utilitarian. They were very kind of like just text over a screen. There was no real animation or graphic element to it, with some exceptions. But, by and large, it was a very straightforward thing that wasn't really meant to be a part of the film proper. It did not advance the story of the film. It did not set up the story. It didn't do anything other than say, this is the title of the film. Here's the people who were involved in making it. And there was certainly not a strong connection to the marketing. Marketing traditionally was film stills. There was the idea of carefully designed posters was not something that was super common. You certainly had posters. You had sort of, and genre film making was a big part of that before it became common for everything. But what Saul Bass did was take the idea of design and modernism and everything that was going on in the 50s and the 60s, and he merged it with these brilliant marketing campaigns for films. He worked very closely with Otto Preminger. He worked very closely with other directors as well. Spartacus he worked on with Stanley Kubrick. He put a stamp on these films. And so when you go back and you look at Hitchcock, for example, who he worked with on Vertigo, he worked with on all these North by Northwest, he worked on these films, and he influenced not just the posters, but he influenced the opening credit sequences, and in some cases directed the opening credit sequences. Kubrick, who is notorious for being a micromanagement kind of filmmaker who just would revel over every detail, was trusting of Saul Bass to basically do the opening sequence for Spartacus, largely unsupervised. And he's just a brilliant, brilliant designer who also worked in the world of commercial design and branding. He did a lot of logos that the Boys United Way. He did all of these phenomenal work across decades. He worked on the opening credit sequence for Casino. He worked with Scorsese late in his career, died in the 1990s, worked very closely with his wife. And so his daughter, Jennifer, partnered up with Pat Kirkham, and they made this book, which is just full of stuff. It's got opening sequences of films broken down frame by frame. It's got sketches. He's got posters, and it goes through all the aspects of his career. And it is just like, if you love design, if you love film, if you love the ways in which those two worlds collide, you probably already know who Saul Bass is. But if you don't, this is just, you could flip through this book for days and not run out of stuff to just sort of marvel over. And really, the strength of the book, in addition to just being exhaustive, is that it really dives into his philosophy. It captures his approach. And one of the things that he's talked about was he wanted title sequences in particular to do something. And so he wanted them to either set up the story, set up the tone of the film, if not the actual narrative. And so when you watch his sequences, they are in some form or fashion putting you in a mindset. They're getting you ready and pumped to get into that film, either just sort of emotionally, or by literally carrying water for the plot. And that influence has then been carried forward. People have literally kind of aped his style. When you look at title sequences like the credit sequence on Wall-E, for example, where you at the end of the film, where you have kind of, there's a story, the entire story of the film you just watched is being animated over credits, which is absolutely a riff on Saul Bass. When you look at Catch Me If You Can, where they actually use that crude two-dimensional animation style that he used on Vertigo and Man with the Golden Arm and all this stuff, they use that same style, but they use it to tell a narrative of this thief being chased by this FBI guy, as a way to kind of set you up for the tone of the film. These are all things that are pulling back from what Saul Bass brought. And so when people think about film design and credit design, particularly in the 1960s, particularly with someone like Alfred Hitchcock, they're thinking about Saul Bass. Even if they don't know the name, they're thinking about Saul Bass. So he's enormously influential and one of my favorite designers ever, not just because of his aesthetic, but because of that approach, because he felt very passionately that from the marketing to the opening titles to the closing credits, that all of these things should be doing something in service of the storytelling power of the film itself.
That sounds like an incredible book for educating people on someone that, as you said, they might not know him by name. And I feel like with credit sequences in particular, often, probably even more so than with a film score, because I think many people increasingly are making sure that they're really attuned to that in films where it's very distinct anyway. But I think with credit sequences, people often don't really pay attention, but Saul Bass kind of made you pay attention. And yet at the same time, he is a name that not enough people know. So unlike the Jewish comedy book, where it's bringing a new perspective and a new analysis to something we all think we know, this is really, it sounds like a good tool for educating people about someone that they don't even necessarily know, and looking at something that they haven't really ever thought about, even if you're a huge film buff. I know I up until recently didn't, the last few years, I really didn't think much about these kinds of things or didn't know who Saul Bass was. And now I recognize it immediately when I watched Casino or when I rewatched some Hitchcock films he did. I was like, I get it and I see it, and more people need to know about it. So I hope more people do seek out that book.
I agree wholeheartedly, and it as educational as it is, because it's 428 pages long. It's like 11 to almost 12 inches tall and like 11 inches wide. Like, it's a big book. It's very educational, but it's also just a deeply beautiful book. It's incredibly well put together. When you open it up, every page has some other beautiful imagery in it. When they do things like title sequences, they lay them out on the page in this really beautiful way. And in fact, it's interesting. After they did this book, a few years later, they came back and did another book that is Saul Bass 20 iconic film posters. And it literally, they said it. They were like, yeah, it's really meant for college kids who want to have cool art on their walls, but they can't afford to buy cool art. So they buy this book, and it's 12 by 16 inches, and every page is one of his posters or one of his title sequences broken down, and they're perforated pages. So the idea is you could it's a book that's meant to be kind of torn apart so that you can, open this book and then you'll get 20 incredible Saul Bass posters that you can then pull out. And if you want to frame them, you can frame them, but if you want to just hang them up on your wall. So I actually recommend that book as well, because it's such a wonderful complement to this, but it's also a great way to get some really cheap, free, beautiful Saul Bass art. He had this incredible eye for aesthetics, and his artwork, whether it was posters or something else, was always very minimalist, kind of simplistic in a way, but also deeply complex in another way. And so, you just can't go wrong with Saul Bass. You can't go wrong kind of exploring Saul Bass. And this giant book that is like twice the size of your head is a phenomenal way to dive into it.
Well, I think that gives our listeners plenty of reading material to seek out before some of these novels do make it to at least a television screen, and to help maybe contextualize and analyze some of their favorite movies as well.
Absolutely. And until next time, we are your hosts, Brad Pilcher
and Sarah Glassberg.
Also producing are Catherine Crosby and Chris Holland, who is also our technical director and editor, and Catherine Cole, our show intern.
The music you've been humming to all show long is by the incomparable Joe Alterman. Please look him up wherever you get your music.
You can always find more from us, as well as show notes, at ajff.org/inconversation. Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Drop us a line with questions, and we just might answer in future episodes.
Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating, a review. Every little bit helps.
And of course, please tell your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.